Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. You're watching a live stream from the Chicago Composers Orchestra. My name is Randall West. I am CCO's Artistic Director. We're happy to share music with you virtually tonight. The Chicago Composers Orchestra is a contemporary music orchestra based in Chicago. Our mission is to present orchestral music by living composers, to extend the orchestral tradition, to make it open, vibrant, and diverse, and to speak to our lives today. What you just saw and heard was a graphic score by Danny Clay called 9 Symbols, along with CCO's musical interpretation of that score. The musicians you're hearing on tonight's broadcast are Sarah Christianson on percussion, Dan Galat on violin, Akshat Jain on tuba, Hans Peterman on bass, and Emily Whitaker on horn. And everyone is actually on camera with us, so we can all wave and say hi. Hello. And in the YouTube, right below the video, we do have the program posted, or we will be posting that in a moment, so you can follow along there. And all the musicians will be on throughout the program and will be joining us for Q&A later. So also on YouTube, you can use the chat feature to post any questions, and we're monitoring that, and hopefully we can get to your question later in the program. Tonight is actually our final live stream from our Drawn Together project. Over the course of the project, we've collected graphic score animations, and CCO musicians have created musical interpretations of those. By a graphic score, I mean that the musicians are literally reading the videos that you're seeing as their music. So instead of reading notes and staves and time signatures on a page, they're purely following the video, and they're using that to guide their interpretations. Something that I think is really cool about this idea is that on the one hand, musicians can be very free in their interpretations, but on the other, they're still using a score. So we're drawing from this this part that's part of our orchestral tradition to be reading a score, but we're doing it in a new way. And we actually have a blog post about the process based on some interviews with CCO musicians. So take a look at that if you haven't read it already. The concept for the project came from San Francisco-based composer Danny Clay, whose scores we're actually sharing with you tonight. And he is also on the line, and we'll have a chat with Danny in a little bit. And we're happy that this project can allow us to connect musically with one another, even though we can't rehearse and perform in the same room. So for tonight's presentation, we've collected 4 animated scores. For each score, we're going to share 3 interpretations with you. For one of the interpretations, each of the musicians that you hear had independently decided how he or she would perform the score. And then they recorded themselves, and we mixed those together. For a second interpretation, we're an orchestra, right? So we should be playing together. And so what we did is we got everyone together on a Zoom call, and we had a really interesting, lively discussion about what an interpretation might be, and came to a consensus for a group interpretation. So everyone submitted a second recording that we mixed together that's based on that group idea. And then for a third interpretation, we're going to share a live performance with you. by one of our musicians who's with us tonight on tuba. Now I'm going to play back the same score that you saw a moment ago by Danny Clay, but I'm going to play it back for you first silently. As you're watching it, think about how you or someone might interpret that score musically. After you see it silently, you'll see a short pause, and then you will hear the interpretation that CCO musicians created of that score, each independently. And then following that, you will hear our group interpretation of that score. So that was a graphic score by Danny Clay. We're streaming this program free for you tonight, but if you like what you see and hear, please consider making a donation to support our musicians and our programming. We put the link to do so in the chat. We are actually towards the end. We have one more day left for our end of year giving campaign, and we had set a $7,500 goal for that. And we actually only have $300 left as of checking earlier this afternoon. So even if everyone on gave $25, I think doing the math, that would allow us to meet our goal. And your support in the past has enabled us to create programs like tonight and continue creating programs and to be able to pay our musicians for their time. And that's something that I think is really important right now, especially given challenging circumstances, of course. I also want to mention that if you donate $25 or more, we'll send you a personalized graphic score with a recording by CCO musicians. And it really is personalized. I actually created this score as a thank you to everyone. And there's some software behind it that generates unique colors, and the actual visuals are unique, and they will be unique to you. So please consider a small donation, and you will receive that. So now I'm going to share another score with you. This score is by Chicago-based artist Selina Trepp. Again, I'm going to play it for you silently first, followed by CCO's individual interpretation, meaning the interpretation that musicians each created independently. And then following that, you will hear the interpretation where musicians came to a consensus as a group. That was a graphic score by Selina Trepp. Danny and Selina are both on the call with us, as is Alan Tinkham, who is our music director, and in a more traditional format would be our principal conductor. So let's take a few minutes for about a 5-minute Q&A with Danny and Selina.
Randall, thank you very much. And Danny and Selina, thank you both for being here tonight, for your fantastic pieces, for all of this, for all the thought-provoking that your work will do tonight, has done, and will continue to do. Danny, since you and Randall, to my understanding, really came up with the idea for this whole thing, tell me first of all about your experiences with this type of graphic scores, and how long have you been doing this? What first inspired you? Just tell us all about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks to all the wonderful musicians this week and all the other weeks that have made this happen, and obviously all these brilliant animators, composers. This has been such a joy to watch all these pieces come together. Graphic notation and animation obviously have both been around for a very long time, and have many different strands of approaches and things. I came to graphic notation as an elementary school teacher, specifically looking for ways to work with young musicians, finding ways for them to feel encouraged to like experiment and make sounds without relying on sort of the notation system that many of us as classical musicians learn. And so I've always been really inspired by working with younger musicians, elementary school, middle school, wondering how they would approach notation if they created it from the ground up. And so for me, this question of graphic notation, it's inspiring because it gives us a chance to sort of reconsider without all of this historical baggage, right? Like what sounds can look like, that's really inspiring to me.
Danny, that is great stuff. And tell me, since you do this with young people as well, really having started doing this with young people, talk a little bit about the differences between doing this with young kids who might have, no baggage at all going into a project like this, no idea of what this should be, as opposed to working with pros, people who, obviously have specific ideas already about how it should be.
Sure. I mean, one of the things I really liked about this project is the playing field was a little leveled for us as composers. I didn't know what my piece was going to sound like until now, which is why I'm so delighted by it. So I think in many ways, this kind of puts us as the composers in their perspective of we're building this thing from the ground up, right? There's for someone like me who doesn't necessarily isn't playing an instrument as part of the final thing, whatever it looks like. There's this feedback circuit of putting an idea down and getting response from it. And I think same thing with working with young musicians. It's so easy and exciting to like make a mark on a page or on a screen or whatever. But then it's like so empowering and just incredible when someone's able to translate that into sounds. And I think like ultimately the process is the same. It's just as like more experienced composers maybe we're using different sets of tools, right? And I mean, like, you know, being on this call with Selina, who is like such a pro animator, versus my kind of like, I'm, you know, on the bottom level of like you know, very simple animation. So you know, we're all using the tools that we have, right?
Danny, that's great. And Selina, I would love to hear from you a little bit about your piece and your experiences coming into this.
Yeah, I come at it from a slightly different angle, where for a really long time already, I've been performing a lot with musicians creating animations that are created on, sort of in real time, and very explicitly not as visuals per se, but as visual music. So as part of the line, working mostly with improvisers and mostly people from sort of the free jazz scene in Chicago. And so through that, I started practicing or really thinking about animations or moving image as how can it be like sound in the sense that it evokes affect. So through dynamics and through tone, like all these different kinds of things like that we talk about when we speak about instrumental music, you can take those words and apply them to visuals and creating a visual language that functions as a line of music. And so these pieces are pieces that are intended to be performed by musicians or looked at, but more not necessarily as a score, but more as like as another line of the music or of an improvisation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Selina. You know, this is one of my favorite things about this project is the idea we're really confronting what a score is and what a composer does, and on a very basic level, how a musician, how a performer turns that into sound. Tell us, Selina, a little bit about what you got out of your piece, and did it fit in with your expectations? Were there any big surprises? What can you tell us?
I mean, it's always surprising. This is actually a very small excerpt of a 40-minute piece that I've been performing since last September, which has been performed by different musicians. So it's a silent piece that actually explicitly functions as a score. So as a music, but really as the lead in the improvisation. And so I'm always interested. So this is a very short excerpt of it. And in it, I've never had it played with this kind of instrumentation, for example, which was really interesting. Also, like for me, it's like seeing how the rhythmic aspect of it is like the interpretation of that with this instrumentation was really interesting to me. I also thought it was really interesting that it seemed more sort of musical than Danny's. Like Danny's was more kind of cartoony and more like Foley almost at times in regards to how it operated, while this really seemed to like bring out some kind of desire for some kind of harmony and rhythmic interaction, which was interesting to see just a different kind of what it evokes. So yeah, it's always very surprising and really gratifying, really interesting.
That's great, Selina. Thank you so much. And Danny, going back to your piece, which was a bit less abstract than Selina's in that there were a number of very obvious events, and there were, first of all, there was the whole sort of treasure map feeling and the idea of, a trip of some kind in between these events. Tell us, I know that you had a system in mind whereby each of the symbols that we arrived at in your piece were supposed to symbolize musical events of some kind. Obviously, the mystery would be in how the players were to interpret those events. But tell us what you had in mind there and how much of it came out.
Sure. I mean, I thought it was cool that Selena mentioned the kind of like Foley thing. You know, the idea that like in a visual, there's a sound has a direct correspondence with what's happening visually. And I think like with my sort of like crude animator brain, like and as a composer thinking about notation, right, where like a sound has or a symbol has a sound that goes with it. Like that's where this comes from. These symbols are things I've been playing around with during this shelter in place time. Again, from working with young musicians, and each of them kind of like just represents like some kind of abstract type of sound. And I was really overjoyed to see how, you know, again, like I was just on a basic level trying to figure out with this score and my other score, just like how to use these symbols in space and in time. And so I love the treasure map idea. Like, yeah, sort of, you know, instead of the journey being like our eyes across the page or whatever, it's like the animation gets to do the journey for us. And I loved how like the tuba and the horn and I think the violin, there were several instruments like captured the like kind of the journey again around the dotted lines and stuff. I was really pleased to like see the whole kind of like movement of the journey get captured in sound. It was super cool.
It's really cool. Well, we should continue with the program. Thank you, Danny and Selena.
Yeah.
Speaking of a journey, we would love for everyone watching to join us on this journey. In addition to the recordings that we've created, we'd like to extend an invitation to all of you to make music with us. You can use any instrument, voice, noise-making device. Professional musician or not is great. And the way to do it is to check out our YouTube page. There are 4 videos called Make Music with CCO, exclamation point. Choose whichever one you like. They are videos from the 4 different streams we've streamed over the past month. Watch the video, play along, and record yourself on your phone or computer. The recording doesn't have to be fancy. And then email your recording to the email in the video. And the videos and sounds will be woven into a final video collage by Danny. And I do want to actually share with you one submission that we've received so far from our community. And this is a performance by composer and electronic musician Carlos Gonzalez. And Carlos is actually a composer that we're excited to be collaborating with for our upcoming season. He is writing a mass for chorus and orchestra that speaks to topics around immigration in the United States and to his experience as a Mexican American. We're going to present in a collaboration with Roosevelt University, and we're looking at a film or documentary aspect to it since we may not be able to perform together safely, so stay tuned. In any case, here is Carlos's and CCO's interpretation of a medley of animations from one of our recent releases. cool. So please, everyone watching, send us your sounds. Choose one of the videos. Something playing in the background there. Choose one of the videos and create a recording and send it along. So what you've heard so far on our broadcast has all been pre-recorded. But as I mentioned earlier, we have one musician who will be sharing a live performance with us. Akshat Jain on tuba is here. And Akshat is going to perform the two scores that we shared with you a moment ago by Danny and Selina, followed by a second score by Danny and a second score by Selina. Akshat, take it away. Akshat, that was so cool.
Thank you.
For everyone watching on YouTube, it's awesome that you could see Akshat as he was playing. What you couldn't see though is everyone's reaction on Zoom. I can see everyone else on the call, and it was like really fun to see everyone's reactions and delight Akshat with what you were doing. Akshat and Alan, let's take a couple of questions.
Randall, thank you so much. And Akshat, thank you so much for those. I mean, I'm honestly not even sure where to begin because there's so much to talk about. I was similar to Randall, like I was watching Danny jamming to that whole thing. And I was just having such a great time watching him having a great time, watching you having a great time. It's, tell us what you did, and I want to start out with one tiny thing, and that is the first piece of each composer seemed much less abstractly interpreted than the second one. It seemed like in the first one there were a lot more definite interpretive decisions you could see in the scores compared to the second score of each of the composers. Tell us, you don't have to start with that, but just tell us what you did.
So I've done a little bit of interpretive score reading before and graphic score reading, and I try to remove whatever preconceived ideas I walk into the performance with. So regardless of how much planning I did and how much time I had to think about what I was going to play tonight, when I started the video, I threw it all out, and I was just like, what's going to happen? With Danny's first video, to me, it was a lot clearer as a path, because you're just kind of rotating through the same path over and over again. So I wanted to kind of embody that chaos of like just not really knowing where you're landing up, but you know that you're going somewhere. And that's where I did like slap tongue, just like air slap tongue to get that kind of percussive noise that you heard from the tuba. And then I had a couple of loose interpretations for each of the symbols in both of Danny's videos. With Selina's videos, it was more like, for whatever, I saw it as a lot busier, but I wanted to kind of take the general motion of what's going on over the actual minutia of each part moving around in the video. And what I'd say is like the first run through of the clip, or the first repetition of the clip, I was probably thinking more just exploratory. And if I liked something, I kept it in the second one, or I tossed it and came up with a new idea for the next time around. And then I tried to keep it kind of similar between the two videos that Danny had, because the symbols were a lot similar. I don't know if that's correct or not. It's just what happened. And that's kind of how I come to those decisions. It was just, I like making weird sounds on the tuba, so.
Akshat, that is great. And you know, one point you made there, which I thought was so interesting, and honestly, so there were so many points, but one that was so huge, and that is how similar is what you do each time, not just each time the repetition happens in one performance, but from performance to performance. How did it change for you?
From performance to performance, I guess it was more about like if I felt like whatever idea I came up with actually impacted with the video to me. So if it lined up in some way, shape, or form, I would toss that idea around a little bit. So for example, like with the up arrow and the down arrow, just making really clear a clear idea of like, okay, I'm going to go up in range and down in range, but then I don't have to do it as cleanly or as violently between each take or each iteration of it. And so I'm doing the same thing, but I'm doing it in a different way.
Mm-hmm. And you know, Selina, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about especially your second piece. I mean, there's I felt like Akshat, I got a lot of what was rhythmically going on, specifically in the first video, in the first score, and the second score, much more abstractly interpreted. Selina, I'd love to know what you felt about what came out of that interpretation of your second piece, and where you thought it might have otherwise gone.
I mean, I honestly don't have preconceived notions necessarily. I think it's the instrumentation again was really, I've never heard it interpreted by this instrument, and I was like often just actually kind of watching you more than the video, trying to figure out how are you making these sounds. I think for me, because of the powdery substances and the way that there's these different kinds of motions and mirroring that are happening, and also more of like a measurement thing that's going on as well. It's a piece that would be easier interpreted with more. Like I think it's actually just one that requires sort of more voices than just one voice. So I saw you very specifically as like the bendy ruler voice more than anything, but much less in the powder end of things. As far as like how I think of them, but yeah, I think that's the main thing. I thought it was really interesting. And then with the first one, because of the rhythmic aspects of what you're doing, and also I really loved how you like started, how I felt like I noticed the way that you cycled through it and how you kept things and things dropped out, which is also how I think about that loop in particular. That worked super well there. Second one I thought was much more, it required more voices to be full. Mm-hmm. Felt like one voice.
Well, speaking of multiple voices, let's continue with our program, and I'll share with you our interpretations of the second of Danny's scores and Selina's scores. So I'm going to start with the second of Danny's scores, and again, like before, I'm going to play it for you silently once, and then following that, you will hear CCO's interpretation that each of the musicians created independently, and then following that, you will hear the interpretation that everyone created as a group. That was so fun. I should have mentioned that there were actually two takes of the individually interpreted score at the beginning, followed by the group interpretation. Again, you're hearing CCO musicians Sarah Christianson on percussion, Dan Galat on violin, Akshat Jain on tuba, Hans Peterman on bass, and Emily Whitaker on horn. So now I'll share with you the second of Selina's scores, again playing it silently first, followed by an individual interpretation, and then followed by a group interpretation. So cool. That was the second of the scores by Selina Trepp. Again, we're streaming this program for you free tonight, but if you like what you see in here, consider making a donation to support our musicians and programming. And if you give $25 or more, you will receive a personalized graphic score. Well, all our musicians are on the line, and we still have a few minutes for Q&A. So Alan and everyone, let's take a few questions.
Randall, thank you so much. And to all the performers, thank you so much for all of your fantastic contributions. Like, this is such a blast watching these. Danny had ones in the chat like a half an hour ago. I could watch these all day. And I could honestly watch these all day. It's so fascinating. And the thing that's the most fascinating about this process is not like whether you like any of these or not, or it's the thought process of how the performers chose the things that they did. And that is, you know, some of the choices were more obvious. And Dan, for example, when you were interpreting Danny's second piece there, especially, it was fantastic when as the dots were jumping around the screen, that we actually heard a little bit of that in the violin part. I appreciated that little bit of representational art amidst all the abstraction, but some of it was so incredibly abstract. Some of the things, Emily, you were doing on the horn, I mean, some of the places where you were just like hanging it out on those low pitches, and I was thinking, what a fascinating way to go at that passage. So, Emily, tell us a little bit about what you did there.
Is it a particular piece that you're thinking of, or just?
Well, I was thinking specifically in Danny's. There was one, I was like the third time through or something like that, where you were hanging out on these pedal tones, and I just thought it was fascinating, like how you came to that from what the piece was doing.
Yeah. Each time you play it through, I kind of think like, what else can I do? What else am I thinking? And I tried all these different kind of techniques on the horn and different things, and I thought, but I haven't played, and I was like, I just want to play a simple tone. And it was interesting how it was used in the recording, because it was just underneath a lot of things that were happening. So I just chose to just play it simple, and I tried to grow as the piece grew. I felt Danny's piece, each picture, it just grew more and more, and so I tried to hold that note there. And then through the other pieces, I did a bunch of different extended techniques, things like that.
Yeah, you had a lot of interesting, I mean, really all the performers have used a fair amount of interesting extended techniques on all your instruments in these pieces. Tell us a little bit about some of what you did.
Yeah, so for a brass instrument, there's a bunch of different things we can do. But for horn specifically, I played with the harmonic series. So if you don't play with any fingers, the lower the pitches are, the further they are, and the higher it gets, the closer they are. It's kind of further apart, but then on some recordings, you kind of heard me rip up, and that's when the harmonic series are closer together. It kind of gets close, and you kind of get that sound. I also played around with stopped horn, which is where we stick our hand in the bell and we stop the sound from coming out, which kind of gives it a different texture of sound. So open, and then close has a different sound. I also played with half valves. So if you hold the valve halfway down, it kind of makes a different sound as well. So this is open. But if you hold it halfway, you can kind of find that middle ground with the sounds different. There's also like clanking the instrument. I did flutter tonguing, which is kind of if you roll your R's through the instrument. Has a different texture as well. And of course, the horn has a huge range, so I played from super low to super high, and I played around with all of that, and I interpreted each piece as it was.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. And Sarah, a lot of your contributions were really interesting, and this, for everyone. I thought everyone's contributions were the fascinating balance between, you know, really active and really going off on your own, but then other times very much in the background. And Sarah, there was a bunch of what you did that was really beautifully in the background and really subtle. But I mean, obviously, as a percussionist, you're dealing with the most instruments and certainly huge variety of possibilities. Tell us a little bit about your process.
Sure. I think I had a similar way of interpreting all of these scores, in that I really tried to express the sense of motion I got from the scores. So I think that would account for how some of it was in the background and then some was more in the foreground. So for example, with Danny's scores, where the motion or the scores were well, I guess in some cases somewhat black and white, but there were more, it was a little bit easier to follow. I had, I think, greater sense of motion or exaggerated sounds with that. And then with Selina's, where everything was a lot more subtle and fluid, I think that's where I really got to embrace being in the background a little more, just playing around with all of the subtle motions in the scores that were going on.
Mm-hmm. And Hans, we haven't, I mean, the bass is ever present in music, and yet we haven't heard anything from you today about what you did. And again, there was a lot of variety. What was your process?
I've been thinking, like, as I've been watching through this, like a lot of the stuff that I played almost is like trying to make order out of chaos. You know, there's a lot of like consistent sound and a lot of consistent sort of maybe trying to grasp on the structure a little bit. I was actually like playing through a mic setup that I don't normally do, and it created kind of this distorted overtone series to a lot of what I was doing, which I really liked. But I think I looked at these interpretations and I understood what the instrumentation was. So, you know, I also had that as part of my process, which is kind of a bass player way to think. But you know, I agree about the motion. Everything seemed to have like this motion. One thing that I would throw in is I'm a very pattern-based person sometimes. So like, obviously the repeating pattern of the animations really sort of informed what I was doing. Like I tried to stick to one specific types of sound per interpretation, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. And Dan, what'd you do?
Hi. So I think there's probably like something that's interesting about this project is there's many ways to do this. So I could only really talk about my personal way. So I took it like kind of literally that this was a score and that I was a performer of the score. So I tried, and we talked about this as a group too, but tried to like take each element and somehow represent it in my submission. So I would basically just kind of play the video a bunch of times, which is an interesting concept when you think about what score study is, just watching a video. And so I played it and then just kind of like tried to improv some sounds and kept what I like and kept what I didn't, and then made a note of what I thought sounded cool and worked, and then tried to like practice it so it lined up with the video. And especially with Danny's videos, with the like, there's so rhythmic, I felt like I had to like, you know, practice what I was thinking a number of times to get it to line up. So that was kind of my process for how I approached it.
Awesome. And you know, what the point you started out with, Dan, about you know, how closely to interpret the process of interpretation, and how specifically it can relate to the various elements in each piece. I just think that this is for me the most fascinating part of a project like this, because you know, I am a conductor, and usually what we are all doing when we get together is we have pre-composed pieces and we are struggling with the notation that the composers have set before us, and there's always some degree of rightness that we're trying to achieve. And especially in the often very complex world of contemporary orchestral music, these these can be extremely complicated and extremely difficult, and so much of the process is just trying to be right. You know, I think of Stravinsky, who said basically play everything in the music and don't do anything else, and that is perfect. Like that's all people need. And this process is completely the opposite. It's there's nothing wrong, really. You know, and maybe this is a good time to turn back to the composers. Danny, Selina, tell us, is there anything wrong possible?
No.
No. Danny?
I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, I think like yeah, it's the spirit of inquiry that's so exciting. This is just, you know, we're all discovering as we go, and that's what's so awesome.
Oh, completely. I couldn't agree more. How about any of the performers? I hate to, you know, we're always very careful about not jumping in on top of each other, but since we're already slightly over, I want to make sure that if any of you, Sarah, Dan, Akshat, Hans, Emily, if anyone has something you'd like to share about going through this process, or how this process made you reconsider what we do all the rest of the time.
I can.
Sorry, Dan. Please, Dan.
Yeah. So it's kind of. I'm going to kind of maybe spin out here a bit, but it's kind of related to the fact this concert was scheduled towards the beginning of June, and you know, so we had very kind of serious other things to focus on during that time. And, you know, so it's been a while since we've kind of thought, or at least I've thought about this project, because it happened right before those events. And I've been thinking about how those relate to our music as a whole. And obviously these are really serious, you know, sort of things. And I'm just one person, but I think the way this specific musical project might relate, doesn't relate directly because it's very abstract, but it deals with kind of the hierarchies we've built in our art form, and maybe other ways that we could explore changing those. So in that sense, maybe there's some relevance.
Boy, that is a really profound idea, that that this is a process that that opens up our perception to new ideas, new ways of seeing old things. And I always think this is the best thing, or among the best things, that contemporary music can do. Is, I mean, music in general, but you know, old music especially. I tend to think of old music more like you know, mind control programs that you listen to for a certain feeling, you know, whereas contemporary music is like, there's especially at the CCO, we have a way of throwing ourselves into things that are mysterious and different, and often unexpected, and it's just, I can't tell you how much fun this is for me, and I hope this is fun for everyone watching. I think it's the spirit of inquiry here that is so fresh and is so necessary, and I hope everyone's having half as good a time as I am, because we're doing well. Randall, what do you want to say about this at the end?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Alan. Thanks, Danny, Selina, and everyone performing. This was really fun for me too, and really, I'm really just honored to be a part of it. For everyone watching, this is our last live stream, but again, please join us. Create your own recording. Send it along. Also, we're going to be posting each of the individual pieces on YouTube. Some of them are already up there from a couple of weeks ago, but from tonight and from the past several streams, for you to come back and watch anything that you liked in particular, and share with others. So please keep, if you missed one of the streams and want to check it out later, please check that out and continue sharing it. And yeah, again, thank you, everyone. And have a good night, everyone.